You ready?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, wonderful. We are here with Dr. Kristin Philips, who just gave a wonderful keynote address at our 2023 Teaching and Learning Symposium here at STLI. Kristin talked to us today about how lecture and active learning don't have to be mutually exclusive, and how we can make lecture more engaging. And she shared a lot of really practical strategies for faculty to get started with if they prefer that lecture modality in class, some ways to make lecture more engaging for students, and to kind of rethink the purpose and the functions of using lecture as a teaching tool. So we just wanted to grab a little bit of her time here in a break from our very active Teaching and Learning Symposium to hear a little bit more of her wisdom and advice for instructors. So Kristin, welcome, and thank you for your address this morning. It was really lovely.
Thank you.
And you showed perseverance and grit in the face of a sudden catastrophic technology failure.
I think the computer died. Is that
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
With no warning. It was like, your battery is low, off. There was no wait time.
Teaching today, you kind of have to be able to handle all of the technological fails that are coming at you, because it happens every day.
You did it with grace.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so one thing that we really want to get at is what is just a practical way that instructors who do use lecture can add more engagement opportunities to their lecture and really pull students in during lecture classes.
That's a really great question. It's really hard to think of one, like what is the one thing that you could do, but part of it is how you portray the information. Like, I know that as faculty, we don't love to identify as an actor, but when you are trying to get people to pay attention to you, you need to be animated in some way, and then people want to continue watching and listening and paying attention. In terms of engaging the students, feedback that I've gotten in the last year from students is when you can give them concrete examples of how they might use that information in some aspect of their life, whether it's professionally or personally, then they're more likely to listen. They need to have a buy-in in order to invest their energy. There's not as much of an interest in learning for the sake of learning anymore, which breaks my heart. We have to really convince them that this is worth it. And so if you can find some way to do that, then that will help get them from the beginning.
So that sounds like a combination of the instructor thinking about, why am I passionate about this topic? What's interesting to me about it, so they can bring their own engagement forth, and then making sure that they almost sell it to students about what's in it for you here. Like, what is the thing that is applicable for your future?
Yes. The salesman-like approach is something that when I got started in science, I got into science because I thought it was very objective and people were going to like my research because it's interesting. And my advisor told me, you have to sell it. I was like, what? And then when I got into academia, same thing. I thought students would find what I find interesting just as interesting. Like, how can you not think this is the coolest thing ever? And they want to know, basically, well, how am I going to use it? Like, cool, that's a great story. Why does it matter? And so, yeah, you have to sell it. And once you kind of get that buy-in, then you can elaborate.
So does part of this selling it then have to do with telling the story of why it matters, or of telling like a larger story of how something kind of falls within the context?
Both. One of my classes, so while I was on a break, I was actually reading the last assignments that were submitted in one of my classes, which is a reflective assignment. And one of the questions is asking them, like, what were some misconceptions you had coming into the class, or what did you think you knew and then you didn't? And a resounding response had to do with, I'd heard about these discrete ideas. So this is neuroscience, so they were talking about like traumatic brain injuries and PTSD, but they never learned about them in a context. And that was a class that I used a lot of stories to illustrate, not just here is an illness or an injury, but here's how it affects people, here's it in multiple dimensions. And then what they kind of got back from that was, well, now I actually feel like I really understand it. So that is partly context, but then also the buy-in part too.
Yeah, and using storytelling to create a schema for them so that they know where this new content fits into what they already know or what their lived experiences have been up to that point.
Yeah, that's a great point. But yeah, exactly.
Now, Briar, you had a question about active learning.
I did.
Yeah, because Kristin used the word active learning in her presentation, and we have a long, storied history here at STLI.
Yeah, what are your feelings? Share with us your wisdom and your feelings about active learning.
So in my talk, I had said how there was this dividing line between the lecture and active learning. To me, from a neuroscientist perspective, the word active learning or the phrase active learning is just redundant. Learning is an active process. If you are not active and intentional about it, it doesn't happen. So just listening to someone is not learning. It's called listening. So
we have a word for that.
It's not until you do something with what you listen to that changes behavior that is learning, and doing something is active. So when I refer to the lecture not being dead, I don't refer to the lecture as being the thing that's going to make everybody learn, but the thing that sets the stage so that they want to.
So then once you do the lecture, do you have assignments where students can be encouraged to then put in the learning into action, or is that kind of expected from the student's perspective if they want to get something out of the lecture, right? To do something on their own to be active?
That's a good question. I don't want to hear myself speak for 75 minutes, and I'm sure nobody else does too. So there's always some sort of activity, whether it's something simple like I pose a question and I ask them to talk about it in their groups, or I have a reputation for bringing whiteboards to my classes. And so I have these big bags with like 11 by 14 whiteboards and dry erase markers and little erasers, and each table gets one. And they have to draw things, write things out, make, I don't know, connections between concepts, or just answer questions, but they have to write it down. And so that gets them kind of thinking and applying and active in their learning.
I definitely used to use the whiteboards, probably, I would say high school, middle school, I don't know. But that brought back a lot of good memories. I think more teachers should do that. It's a good time.
I like whiteboards.
They're fun. They're really fun.
What's your typical class size?
Oh, that varies. My senior seminars are around 24, and then my introductory class is 170.
So could you talk to us a little bit about some of the ways that you switch things up? Sorry, Briar, you want to ask that question?
No, yeah.
Yeah, you ask it, and then we'll make it like magically.
Okay, from the whole thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are your typical class sizes?
I
know, sorry. The awkwardness that is we just changed who's asking the questions. Try again. Ready?
I missed that part. Okay, ready, go.
So what are your typical classes like?
Well, I teach a range of classes, so I have smaller ones that are senior seminars, those have about 24. And then I have an introductory course that's 170.
Wow.
I've got courses in between that range from 40 and 50, 100 and 120, so it really depends.
So how does that change your instruction? What are things that you do differently between, a small seminar versus a really large lecture course?
Well, there's differences in the class size, but then there's differences in the classroom setup. So smaller classes, I usually get pod-style seating that encourages more group work and interpersonal dialogue, whereas the large classes have that stadium seating, and it's really hard to get them to talk to people next to each other because they try to leave space in between each other. And it's also a matter of the content. So a senior seminar is all about applying. They're not necessarily there to learn new foundational information, but make sure that they know what it means. And the introductory course is the first time they're ever visiting this content. So for my introductory students, I want to convince them that they should stick with it. Even if it's hard, it's interesting. Many of the concepts are highly abstract. And again, like I was saying in the talk today, that's a whole picture that I have in my head because I've been doing this for 20 years. This is the first time they've seen it. They don't make those connections yet, and I have to convince them that they're there. But for my older students, it's more about, isn't this cool? Isn't this fun? Don't you want to continue doing this? And so the maturity, the level of engagement differs across all of those classes.
So it sounds like you're very aware of your potential expert blind spots going
try to
into
be.
a lecture. Yeah.
It's always a learning curve. I like that, expert blind spots. But there are definitely assumptions that I make that I figured, well, they remember that from their prerequisite course, and they don't. And there's just certain terminology that I've used, and they're like, I had a student a couple weeks ago, what is a precursor? You keep mentioning precursor. And I was like, oh, that's not a word I knew I had to define. I should probably make a more active effort to define words that are maybe not everyday jargon and just not make assumptions.
Great point. Any more questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, for your wonderful address this morning, and then for giving up a little bit more of your time to talk with us about these great ideas.
Of course. Thank you very much for
we
the
really
invitation.
appreciate it, and thanks for bringing your expertise to William & Mary.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.